It is now with great pleasure that I introduce my father, Daddy Dunbar. And he's not just Daddy Dunbar to me. A whole generations of students used to get comments on papers from him, and the comment would either be followed by a daddy or a Dunbar, and depending on the appropriateness for the context. Anyway, T. Dunbar Moodie is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Anthropology at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He grew up in South Africa, received a Master's of Divinity from Oxford, and a PhD in Religion and Society from Harvard. He is author of The Rise of Afrikanerdom and Going for Gold, and numerous articles. He has 3 grown children and lives in West Tisbury for several months each year, as well as Durban and Swellendam in South Africa. He's both a grandfather and a great-grandfather, and he reads a captivating bedtime story.
Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. What I'm going to say is entitled "A Person is a Person by Other People." And I want to start by saying, as Mary Jane pointed out, for much of my teaching career, I taught classical social theory, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Simmel. But even in my intro courses, I always included the great American thinker George Herbert Mead, who argued cogently for the social formation of the human self. Self-consciousness, he argued, was only possible by social interaction. We have both an I that sees and a me that stabilizes and nourishes us. Indeed, only higher primates like us are self-conscious enough to be able to actually see themselves in a mirror as themselves. And now, as we know, also elephants and porpoises, and perhaps other profoundly social creatures that we don't know about yet. Self-consciousness is a social phenomenon. Human self-consciousness enables us to locate ourselves in social interaction. We construct societies, and happenings become historical events. Indeed, even in my intro course at Hobart William Smith, I'd include an essay by George Herbert Mead and assign what I used to call a self-paper to my students. Students were required to write about the social formation of themselves, or at least some kind of aspect of that. The best of those student papers always fascinated me. They revealed extraordinary life stories, some happy, but many less so. I soon started giving 2 sets of comments on those papers. PM for Professor Moodie, and that went with a grade, and then DD for Daddy Dunbar, often with a smiling face, trying sympathetically to address personal aspects of their stories. For a couple of years in the early 1990s, I was awarded a grant by the Ford Foundation to run a program at Andover Newton Theological School, up the way here, for South African community activists who were also committed church people. I taught a sort of intro class there for them, also offered as an option for Andover Newton American theological students. Of course, I assigned the article by Mead, spelling out his theory. The American students, as usual, were fascinated, but black South Africans were not at all impressed. Come on, they'd say. What's so new about that? We all know a person is a person by other people. This is a standard proverb amongst at least Bantu-speaking African people. So that an early version of Mead's insight was indeed built in to African conceptions of the social self. Of course, such persons formed by interaction with close others are sadly not necessarily good or even nice people. I vividly recall a William Smith student marching into my office one day, waving a paper sheet written, "Professor Moodie," she said, "how come I got a C? I'm a full payer." My response was obvious. You do C work, you get a C. But her sense of entitlement was not entirely unique at the colleges. One wonders about her personal history now and where she's ended up. Yeah. She certainly did not take another course with me. But then I also recall an excellent African-American student walking back with me to the dining hall after one class one day and saying, "I'm so grateful to my 5th grade teacher. She taught me to read." No doubt her being at the college was at least partially funded from higher fees paid by the full payers, a primary source for bursary funds. Social institutions and interactions do not guarantee worthwhile selves, and all of us are probably something of a mix. Moreover, a person is also made not only by other persons, but obviously also by events impacting us. More or less accidental, more or less historical occurrences that have to be located in relation to ourselves. Events ultimately require decisions made with other persons and institutions as well as by ourselves. They have a social impact, and we are obliged to live by them. And today, I thought I might impose on you, in the time that remains, what I myself might now say in a personal self-paper that I might write as I come nearer the end of my own life. Perhaps such self-indulgence, and I apologize, will inspire you to engage in similar reflections on your own social self-formation, with gratitude or perhaps distaste for yourselves and significant others in your own lives. My earliest memory is my grandmother walking me along the beach and telling me I now had a brother. I was 2 years old. From that moment until I went away to university at the age of 17, we were inseparable. I have very, very few, if any, early memories that don't include Kevin. Even being spanked, since we were naughty together. And Dad always spanked him first, so I had to go through it twice. The price of being the eldest. We really did do everything together. I have next to no memory of early experience without Kevin as a significant other, a companion. After the end of the war, my father, and that shows you how old I am, right? Who was a coast artillery officer, was transferred to Robben Island in Table Bay, outside Cape Town. It had been a prison island for Xhosa anti-colonial rebels, then became a leper colony, and eventually a base for the big guns protecting Cape Town Harbour from Japanese battleships, before becoming yet again a famous prison, housing Nelson Mandela and others opposed to apartheid. But when we lived on the island, there were just 3,000 odd troops there. My father was OC, and Kevin and I had the run of the place. Our sister was born when we were there. We didn't wear shoes until I was 9 years old. I started school there with 5 or 6 other kids. Only time I ever came first in my class. I've had a thing for islands ever since. And I fell in love with the vineyard on our first day trip here in 1970 during a 6-month writing leave at Chatham on the Cape. Meredith Aldrich, my late wife, was always a Boston girl. But back to Kevin and our childhood. Dad went straight from the island to a 20-month artillery course in Plymouth, in Devon. We lived in Saltash, in Cornwall, and my youngest brother was born there. Then back to Wynberg military camp in Cape Town, but always Kevin and I were together, riding our bikes a couple miles to school and back together every day, playing cricket in the backyard, teenage bebop parties, climbing Table Mountain, sharing a small room. He snored. We were inseparable until I went off to college. Kevin ended up studying engineering at Oklahoma State. He was a mechanical genius, always. Right? He took engines out of cars in our garage. On his way over to the US, I was already studying divinity at Oxford. His flight stopped in Luxembourg en route. I used the money for my flight home to buy an old Morris Oxford van and met him there. We had sleeping bags in the back and drove down to the south of France and up to Scotland. And after several weeks, I dropped him off again in Luxembourg and, exhausted, crashed the van in Canterbury on the way back to my final year at Oxford. That disastrous event was a major turning point for me. I had no fare to go home to South Africa. It had been invested in this thing. They paid me out for the tires. So when I was done, in that final year at Oxford, an American acquaintance suggested that I apply to doctoral programs in the US. Since Fulbright travel scholarships at that time were granted to foreign students. I applied to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, and Union Seminary in New York City, and to my astonishment, I was accepted at all of them. But Fulbright travel grants were not awarded to white South Africans. So my father arranged for me to fly from Paris to Pretoria in a plane, carrying crates of South African Air Force airplane parts, and then he paid for a boat trip to the US. That first summer in the US, I hitchhiked across the country from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Oklahoma City to spend the long vacation with Kevin. His speech at our wedding reception in Boston some years later, was perfect. He graciously sort of handed me over to Meredith. He married soon after, and we saw less of one another. 4 years or so ago, he died of ALS in Nashua, New Hampshire. There was time to say goodbye, and part of him still lives in me and my other siblings and in his wife and children. When I got to Harvard, my PhD was in religions and society, a welcome step back to social commitments after engaging at Oxford with biblical studies, which I enjoyed, and dogmatic theology, which seemed to me to lock spiritual truths into intellectual argument. Professor Robert Beller was on sabbatical when I arrived at Harvard. When I returned, he made an appointment, and I saw him in his office. He'd quite recently published a famous article on religious evolution. He'd been a student and was a close colleague of Talcott Parsons, whose ideas I eschewed. I told him so, and said I disagreed with his article, which I must admit I did also rather respect. He leaned forward in his chair and he said, "Tell me why." And I spilled out at length my critical concerns about biological analogies and sociological reductionism. He leaned back and smiled. "I think we can work together." Indeed, it was so. My PhD thesis was a critical study of Afrikaner civil religion, which is Beller's term. And as I was finalizing the book, Bella was offered a permanent position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He promptly invited me to join him there for a year, and it was indeed an honor to go there with Meredith, and by then 3 little ones. Mary Jane had a birthday while we were at the Institute. Perhaps her 5th? I think so. Meredith insisted on us having her classmates from the Institute's childcare center to a party, and she made 3-foot cardboard cutouts for each of the guests. We stuck them up on the wall, each one holding a packet of candies and a little gift, so that Mary Jane would not be the only one receiving and opening presents. When we colored in the cutout figures for each child, Mary Jane was able to tell us the eye color of each of her classmates. Wow. But she had not noticed that 2 of them had brown skins. That was a revelation I have never forgotten. But let me conclude. Genetics, of course, is not irrelevant for the persons we human beings become, but a person is not a person by inheritance alone. Personal development requires other individuals. I would not be who I am, for what it's worth, if Kevin, Bob Bella, and indeed Meredith, and for that matter Mary Jane and her siblings, had never been. And I have no more than mentioned my parents, my sister, and other brother. And I haven't mentioned Claire, an old friend and now my new wife, and many friends and so many old colleagues. And this only skims the top. I could name many others. Indeed, I should probably have included with George Herbert Mead many, many other scholars whose work continues to enrich me. You will all have your own people and your own books and movies and music. Living with others creates individual self-awareness and nurtures or sometimes tortures our very selves. It all happens as social institutions, organizations, and events confront us, and we try to meet them imaginatively and as creatively as possible. Thank God for that.